So it's great to have Joseph Dana with us here today. He's a journalist, a blogger, and filmmaker living in Jerusalem. If you haven't seen his stuff, you should really check it out online. You could see it at josephdana.com, and he also writes for a variety of other online and print resources. His coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict focuses on the Palestinian unarmed resistance movements throughout the West Bank and the impact of Israel's occupation on Palestinian life. He is a contributing editor to the Israeli web magazine 972, and his writing has been featured in The Nation, Electronic Intifada, Le Monde, The New York Times, Alternate, Pulse, and Haaretz, and he's active as well in Israeli direct action groups such as Ta'ayush and Anarchists Against the Wall. We're going to have, of course, a Q&A session afterwards. For those watching online, you can direct your questions to our speaker today via the chat roll on the webcast page, or you could send them in via Twitter by tagging Pal Center or sending a direct message to @Palestine Center. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Dana.
Thanks everybody for coming out. It's quite an honor to speak at the Palestine Center, and I want to express gratitude to Youssef for organizing this event today. I'm going to be talking about the Palestinian unarmed resistance since 2003 to the Israeli occupation, and specifically to the Israeli separation barrier, which has been under construction and has been constructed in certain villages. While there's a long history of Palestinian nonviolent resistance, unfortunately we don't have the time to go through it completely, so I'll start with the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada started as a popular civilian movement, an uprising with strikes, marches, demonstrations across a broad spectrum of Palestinian civil society, including men, women, and children. In the first month alone, the Israeli response was the use of over 1,300,000 bullets to smash the unarmed resistance. The idea being resistance was going to be left over against the occupation, and an armed resistance from a military perspective, from an Israeli military perspective, is much easier to handle. And so this use of bullets and other violent means to crush the nonviolent resistance was largely successful, and the Second Intifada, as we all knew, moved into a period of armed resistance, and this resulted in the decision by Israel to erect a barrier between Israeli and Palestinian society, and also on the ground between the West Bank and Israel. Now, unfortunately, this barrier was not constructed on the internationally recognized border, the Green Line. It was constructed mostly deep within Palestinian territory in the West Bank. In some cases, the barrier was constructed between villages and their farmlands and their agricultural fields or their olive groves and things like that, directly affecting the livelihoods of these poor farmers mostly. And so the idea to create an unarmed resistance to this separation wall was taken by a number of small villages, and the first village to do so is a village called Budrus, the first significant village, I should say. And the saga of this village is actually now featured in an excellent documentary, which is showing in Washington and New York and Los Angeles and other places around the United States. So I highly suggest seeing this film if you haven't already. And Budrus adopted a model of unarmed resistance to the separation barrier through the use of mass mobilization of popular civilian society, men, women, and children, and interestingly enough, the inclusion of Israeli and international activists in solidarity. This was in 2003, and it took the form of marches, demonstrations to the site of the construction of the barrier, in some cases actually directly confronting the construction equipment, jumping in front of it in nonviolent resistance. And I'm happy to say that their model of resistance worked. The Israeli government decided to reroute the placement of the barrier in Budrus, saving the village's farmlands. All but I think they were going to lose something like 180 dunums of land, and they were able to maintain all of it except for 6 dunums or something like this. And so it was largely successful. And so this model of popular resistance against the separation wall then spread to other villages throughout the West Bank that were engaged in similar situations. Most notably, Bielin has become the international symbol of this, and they've been engaged in nonviolent resistance to the separation wall since 2005. Now, while Budrus was a success, the Israeli military learned from this model of unarmed resistance and decided to engage in a platform and a campaign of violent repression of these demonstrations. And this campaign took basically 3 forms, and I'm going to discuss this a little bit. The first form of violent repression came in the use of the disproportionate use of violence in the demonstrations themselves. Oftentimes these demonstrations would begin in the village, kind of like what you see here with banners and flags and chants and things like this, going to the space of the construction of the wall, and they're met with the use of tear gas, sound grenades, in some cases rubber-coated steel bullets, and in some cases live bullets. Since 2005, over 20 unarmed demonstrators have been killed in these demonstrations. And this is because of a negligent use of arms within the ranks of the Israeli military. Just some examples of this. On December 28th in 2008, a 22-year-old was shot in the back with live ammunition and killed. And then a 20-year-old was shot in the head with live ammunition in the same demonstration and died 3 days later as a result of his wounds. And we see a lot of this type of repression. We also see the use of high-velocity tear gas projectiles as bullets themselves, as opposed to firing them on an angle as they're supposed to be used. They're often used as bullets and fired directly at demonstrators. And this has resulted in the death of at least one demonstrator directly, and in fact the serious injury of an American activist in Nielin in 2009 that left him crippled and paralyzed for life. Incidentally, all of these tear gas canisters are made in Pennsylvania, so since we're speaking in the United States, that will be some nice homework for people to look into. As I said before, the use of live ammunition has become a mainstay. The Army itself declared that the use of live ammunition was forbidden in crowd-controlled situations, and the appearance of live ammunition went away for a time, but during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza, the use of live ammunition made a very triumphant return to these demonstrations, and this has resulted in the deaths of many children, in fact, including 14-year-old children. I'm just kind of using slides to give a visual representation of what I'm talking about. This is a 14-year-old child that was killed by a live bullet in Nielin as a result of one of these demonstrations. What we also see is the cover-up of this criminal conduct, of the negligent use of arms by the Israeli military. So we do not have any sort of civilian trials or even military trials of the soldiers that are responsible for these crimes. Instead, we see operational debriefings, which mean effectively nothing to civil society. What's most significant in terms of the repression of the nonviolent movement in Palestine right now, specifically in terms of these separation wall demonstrations, is the use of legal persecution against popular committee leaders. When a village in Palestine decides that it's going to have a nonviolent demonstration against the separation wall or the occupation itself, a popular committee is formed inside the villages. Oftentimes these villages are quite small. Budrus, I think, has something like 1,500 people. Another village that's engaged in similar activity, Nebe Saleh, has 500 people. They're very, very small agricultural villages, and they form a popular committee made up of members coming from the village to decide how they're going to do these demonstrations, when they're going to do these demonstrations, if they're going to invite Israelis or international activists, etc. And so they're led. What Israel's been doing recently has been systematically arresting all of the leaders of these popular committees. So oftentimes I know it's discussed in the United States where this question comes up, where is the Palestinian Gandhi, right? Why don't the Palestinians adopt nonviolence? Well, there's many Palestinian Gandhis. All you need to do is look at the leadership of these popular committees that are engaged in nonviolent resistance, and you can find plenty of them. Unfortunately, many of them are in jail. Since 2009, the Israeli army has carried out 46 arrests in the West Bank village of Neilin alone, and this number is growing consistently. In fact, just yesterday, the army invaded Bialin and arrested people in the middle of the night, including one of the popular committee chair people. What happens when these popular committee leaders are arrested? They're often charged with a blanket term of incitement, right? This is a charge that has no specific meaning in the Israeli military court system. It's rather, it can mean just organizing demonstrations. That's the official charge that's often used. In fact, according to Israeli military law specifically, incitement is, quote, any attempt, whether verbally or otherwise, to influence public opinion in the area in quotation marks, in a way that may disturb the public peace or public order. So this can really mean anything. Recently, within the last 2 months, 2 very high-profile anti-wall popular committee leaders have been sentenced to long terms in prison. These are Adib Abu Rahman and Abdallah Abu Rahman from the West Bank village of Bialin, and they were both charged with incitement and illegal protest. In the case of Abdallah, just to give you an idea of how this military system is working, Abdallah was initially charged with the illegal possession of firearms because he had collected used tear gas canisters in demonstrations and then made an art exhibition out of them, making peace signs and things like that. And when he was arrested, Israeli authorities asked where his permit was, and he said, well, you've been shooting these at us for the last couple of years. And so they charged him with illegal possession of firearms. And just the kind of perversion of the military court system. So Abdallah was arrested. He sat in jail for about a year while his proceedings went through, and he was ultimately charged with incitement and illegal protest. Now, the charge of incitement came mostly on the testimony of 14-year-old children. About 4 14-year-old children were arrested in the middle of the night in Bialin. They were interrogated in the middle of the night without access to legal counsel or without their parents present, and basically asked if Abdallah or any of the popular committee chair people had asked them to throw stones in these demonstrations. Now, Bialin is systematically filmed. The Israelis created a kind of watchtower, and the whole area is filmed. And so there's no actual evidence of Abdallah either directing stone throwing and or throwing stones himself. And yet he was charged with incitement of stone throwing on the testimony of these 14-year-old children. So this is giving you an idea of the legal persecution of these nonviolent demonstrations. The same is true in the case of Adib Abu Rahman. The same sentences have been proclaimed against him, the same convictions. I'm happy to say that the European Union, and specifically the United Kingdom, have been very active in monitoring this situation. During the trials, we were bringing at sometimes up to 15 diplomats to observe the trials in the military court, and this resulted in the EU High Commissioner on Human Rights a woman named Catherine Ashton, coming out with a statement calling Abdullah Abu Rahman a human rights defender and calling for his immediate release and the sentence being thrown out. Just last week, the UK foreign minister, a conservative in the United Kingdom, met with leaders of the popular struggle in an expression of solidarity. And so while the climate in the United States might not be as nice as we would like it, the climate in Europe is very aware at the development of this current manifestation of unarmed demonstration in Palestine and very supportive of it. I want to make a brief comment on the role of Israeli solidarity activists in this movement. One of the most profound aspects, at least for me personally, on the ground is to see the real coexistence and cohabitation between Israeli and Palestinian activists engaged in this work together in solidarity. The Israeli left, while in the 1990s was quite strong, and there was a number of very high-profile protests in Tel Aviv, 100,000 people, etc., kind of failed in pushing a real platform of coexistence between Israeli and Palestinian society. And as a result of this failure and the Second Intifada, a residue was left over in Israeli society. They came to the conclusion that it was necessary for Israeli activists to go to the space of occupation itself because of the proximity of the occupation to Israeli territory, and express solidarity and confront occupation forces, etc., with their own bodies, as it were. And this was done not in a way of, okay, Israelis are going to go into the West Bank and decide how these demonstrations are going to happen, etc. It was done as a form of solidarity. It was done as Israelis saying, we have privilege in these situations. We can change the balance of violence, and we would like to come and help you, Palestinians that are engaged in these demonstrations, understanding that these are your demonstrations. You make the decisions. You have to live with the repercussions. And so since 2003, a group, specifically the Anarchists Against the Wall, have been engaged in weekly and sometimes daily solidarity work. And so as you can see in this photo, we have an Israeli suffering from tear gas and a Palestinian kind of consoling him in the West Bank village of Bialin. And the results of this solidarity work, I think, have been quite profound. While the Israeli left is still somewhat small, it's become very energized as a result of this type of stuff. And if you are all familiar with what's going on in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, there are initiatives that are gaining strength in Israeli society and specifically in American Jewish society in terms of approaching the conflict in a different way. I'm going to continue with some slides just to give some visual representation, and we'll discuss them so you get an idea of what these demonstrations look like on a daily basis. This violent repression really knows no end in terms of the ability of Israeli forces to tear gas ambulances that are evacuating wounded demonstrators and things like that. And this is very important, that unarmed demonstration in the West Bank is not easy in any stretch of the imagination. And to engage in unarmed demonstration as a Palestinian community, one has to be prepared to risk alienation from mainstream Palestinian society in some contexts, and also be subject to collective punishment measures all the time. And so there are, like I said, just last night there was a night raid in Bialin. There's massive collective punishment going on, and people are dying. And so it's not light to say that this is a very significant development in terms of the resistance to the occupation in Palestine. Again, this is the tear gas. This time in Nielin. As I said before, this mobilization of civil society in unarmed demonstrations often take the form of marches, strikes, and demonstrations to the space of the construction of the separation wall. And And this kind of captures what's going on. This is a device that that the Israeli military is using often, that fires something like 45 rounds of tear gas in one shot, in one quick shot, and covers a whole area. When we're lucky, they're using it on the space of demonstration, and when we're not lucky, they're actually going into a village and then just spraying the entire village, and leaving us with, you know, men, women, and children that are not involved in the demonstration, that are dealing with the effects of nonviolent protests. Again, chants, lots of lovely chants, lots of chants of solidarity. Recently in Nielin, which is one of the only villages in which the separation wall has actually been built during an ongoing protest against the wall. It's important to note, like I said in the beginning, Budrus was successful in moving the placement of the wall from the center of the village, cutting it off from the agricultural lands, to the outskirts, leaving the agricultural lands intact. In Bielin, there's a fence right now, and the Israeli Supreme Court has ruled that the placement of the wall is illegal, and it should be moved, but it hasn't been moved yet. The international community has ruled the wall to be illegal in all capacities in its current placement inside Palestinian territory. And I'm doing some events around the East Coast talking about these issues, and oftentimes a lot of very right-wing supporters of Israel bring up the question of security, that this is a security measure that Israel's doing, and how can you be against Israeli security? Clearly, it's not about security because of its placement. It's about annexation. It's about Israel creating a final status agreement with itself, of creating a final border between the West Bank and Israeli territory, and deciding where that final border is going to be without any consultation. If it was about security, this wall, it would be built on the Green Line, and then there would be no issue. I know many Palestinian friends, people in the popular committees, are not against the wall as a wall or as a security measure. They're against the wall in the middle of their land, cutting them off from their livelihood. And so it's always an important distinction to bring that up when we're talking about these demonstrations. Again, we have the use of sound grenades in this specific situation, Israeli and international and Palestinian activists all together. As I said, when Israelis are involved in these demonstrations, we have a very unique sense of privilege. If I get arrested in a demonstration, I legally can see a judge within 24 hours. If a Palestinian is arrested in the same situation, it's 72 hours, and it can go up to 2 weeks. And they enter into a very strange and bizarre legal system which I'm not privy to. And so I have an enormous sense of privilege in these demonstrations, so I can be putting myself on the front lines, as it were, and changing the dynamics for the demonstration and for the Palestinians to exercise their legitimate desire to have nonviolent and unarmed resistance to the occupation. Again, nonviolent creativity. The creativity aspect of these demonstrations is incredibly important, like with all nonviolent struggles. In Bielin specifically, they've done some very incredible actions in which they've built Palestinian walls next to the Israeli wall and said, okay, you guys can't enter. And then, of course, the army comes in and destroys it and everyone's arrested. But it's, again, showing these kind of double standards and trying to bring a different light to the situation. This is I thought it was kind of a pretty picture, that's why I included it, but this is, as I said, if a village is going to be engaged in a nonviolent demonstration, they have to be ready to pay the cost. This is in Nielin. After the 10-year-old boy who I showed you the photo of earlier was killed, there was basically a series of riots protesting this death, and the army invaded continuously the village, and this is in the beginning of one of the invasions, kind of heralding the arrival of Israeli troops inside the olive groves. Another form of collective punishment and the use of violence is this mechanism called the skunk, which is a petrochemical that smells quite bad, and it basically stays on your skin for 3 weeks, something like this. You can't get it out. They spray it over demonstrations, and it didn't really work. They were using this on the demonstrators themselves, but the demonstrations continued. All of these means of repression haven't been completely successful. That's why we continue to see an escalation in repression with the throwing in jail of all of the popular committee leaders. That's the current manifestation. And so after it didn't work on spraying on demonstrators themselves, they decided to take it into villages and spray it into houses, leaving the houses effectively, you can't live there, right, for months or something like this. And so this is just another escalation in the conflict. One of the positive aspects of this current manifestation of unarmed and nonviolent resistance in the West Bank is the ability to use social media in disseminating the information about what we're doing to a large audience. I'm doing this personally with Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and things like that. But with this availability and this kind of instant nature of getting information out, I think that we have the ability to change the dynamic on the ground insofar as making sure that the international community knows that there is a real, vibrant, unarmed, and nonviolent resistance in Palestine. That this question of where is the Palestinian Gandhi, like Nicholas Kristof recently said in the New York Times, is actually an irrelevant question because there are Palestinian Gandhis, because there is a real, viable alternative to violent resistance in the West Bank. And this is an alternative that's being explored by Palestinians, from what I understand, because of a strategic rationale, because violent resistance isn't necessarily achieving the gains that one might hope for in the end of the Israeli occupation. And so strategically adopting a nonviolent resistance and even inviting Israeli Jews to partake in that nonviolent resistance is something that is quite exciting. And the use of social media is definitely changing the framework. And so when this little device comes into a village on a Friday, most of the demonstrations happen on Fridays, but they happen all through the week. But Friday is really the mainstay of the demonstrations. When this little device comes in and sprays an entire house, leaving the family on the street for months, we can all see that in the United States or wherever we happen to be, because videos are uploaded to YouTube immediately, or the event is tweeted, or the event is discussed on Facebook. And so that allows us an incredible amount of privilege and power in successfully countering some of the propaganda that's coming from the other side about the Palestinians' true goals. Again, this is this device that fires a huge amount of tear gas at one time, covering areas. This is in Nealin. This is actually in the area of the demonstration, and it's often used inside villages themselves. It's really not fun when you're involved in this kind of thing. I mean, it's quite pretty to photograph, and I always enjoy taking pictures of it, but it's really chaotic. And oftentimes the Israelis are trying to paint these demonstrations as violent because there are instances of stone throwing. The popular committees are all committed to a platform of nonviolence. Again, going back to this issue of strategic rationale, right? If we throw stones, this will give a rationale to the Israelis to use more violence, to come and do night raids and to arrest us and things like that. So it's not really in our interest to have stone throwing. But when you have a device like this being fired in a village, in a small village, there's going to be pockets of mostly youth that are going to respond. And that response is usually in stone throwing. And stone throwing from a huge difference. In fact, usually the most injuries that come from stone throwing are other Palestinians or activists, because you're throwing a stone from a distance of 30 or 50 meters, and there's people between you and the army that are also part of the demonstration. And so this is happening, unfortunately, often in which other people in the demonstration are just getting hit by an errant stone or something like this. But this is a real, when it comes to the intricacies of this current manifestation of nonviolence in the West Bank, this is the issue that's being debated about how to quell stone throwing as to not give a rationale to the Israeli military for escalation of violent measures. Since 2005, as I said, since Budrus, other villages, many villages, have adopted the same model of nonviolent resistance. And the neighboring village of Nielin, which has become one of the most dangerous, as it were, in terms of the amount of death that has happened there, engaged in a similar resistance platform, and the Israelis actually built the wall right in the middle of the agricultural fields. This is the only place where the wall has actually been built, and the demonstrations continue. As you can see, it's quite common for Palestinians to set the wall on fire with tires and things like this, and this is done. They give a lot of kind of symbolic reasons for why the wall is being set on fire, to show the scarring of the land and all of this kind of stuff. But the demonstrations continue. For the fall of the Berlin Wall, they actually upended a part of the wall in Nielin, and that was a very interesting action. And I'm going to Nielin every Friday. This is a village I can say personally that I've developed a really close relationship with in terms of the people on the ground, because in terms of the interaction between Israeli activists and Palestinian activists, we are friends. If you were to ask me why am I doing this, I would say I'm against the occupation and these are my friends. It's just that simple. It's not some grand political platform that I want to disseminate. It's that these are my friends, and we talk about sports and we talk about the weather and whatever. And so I'm going to Nielin on a regular basis on Friday, and oftentimes the popular committee chairs will call for the release of Gilad Shalit during these demonstrations, which is something that's always quite interesting given the really radical climate of discussion when it comes to Gilad Shalit, the imprisoned Israeli soldier in Gaza. But the people of Nielin, the popular committee leaders, are in support of his release. And so they often approach the wall with a microphone, speaking in Hebrew to the soldiers on the other side, saying, "We call for the release of Gilad Shalit. Think about what you're doing, shooting rubber bullets at poor farmers like us, and can we have our land back? This is ridiculous." And so this is the kind of the way that these things develop. And then the soldiers end up invading the village, coming through the wall. There's a little door, and then arresting protesters. Sometimes they're arresting actual medical staff and things like this. And shooting rubber-coated steel bullets, the use of a lot of tear gas and things like that. So that's how these demonstrations are functioning in Nielin. This is inside of a house after one of those tear gas clouds. I often say, I ask myself if I would have the, let's say, moral clarity to behave like the Palestinians in these situations, if I was in those situations. Specifically, I'm there. I'm an Israeli Jew. I'm an American Israeli Jew. I'm in solidarity with them. And the Israeli army is invading these villages. And Palestinians, friends, are taking me in, and we're suffering together. And they're cooking me dinner, and they're telling me that I need to stay, and they're giving me more and more tea. And I often ask myself, if I was in Tel Aviv and Palestinian soldiers were invading Tel Aviv, shooting left and right, and children were dying, if I would have the ability to recognize these people, these activists that were in solidarity with me, and take them in. And this is a question that I wrestle with because it's quite difficult, I think. But the Palestinians are able to do this in a very profound way. And this is a very motivating factor for me to keep doing the work that I'm doing, and for, I think, a lot of Israeli activists that are involved in this to keep doing the work that they're doing. And in that way, you see an actual grassroots initiative of coexistence and cohabitation. If we forget about the separation wall in these demonstrations, we see a movement of Israelis and Palestinians that are engaged in real work together, that are building friendships. And friendships are in short supply when it comes to Israelis and Palestinians right now in the region. And we're doing it. And I think that's something that a lot of my writing lately has been focusing on. And I think it's a very positive initiative for the future. This is Bielin. This is a very good demonstration of what these protests in Bielin have become. As you can see, there's even a car with a little satellite thing. The media has picked up on this story in a very significant way, at least in Europe. And you see the fence over on the left side, the extreme left side, and how these demonstrations go. This road, this small road here, leads to the village. The villagers and the Israelis and the international activists join together, walk to the site of the fence, proclaiming an end to the fence, whatever. And then the army responds with the use of tear gas, usually invading the village grounds, trying to arrest protesters. Recently, the former European Parliament speaker was arrested in these demonstrations, and so they really have no shame in terms of who they're arresting. And as I said, the media has covered this in somewhat of a spectacle, and I think they're doing a relatively good job. But I would recommend using the social media as the best way to get information from the ground. With the use of Twitter, you can get these updates as they're happening, and so that's exciting. This is the day in Bielin in which commemoration of the Berlin Wall falling, that the wall was actually upended. And as you can see, the Palestinians are wearing masks. This is not because they look cool, but because it's a measure against the Israelis having the ability to come into to villages and arrest Palestinian youth. Effectively, if you're a Palestinian between the age of 14 and 30, and you live in one of these villages, you could have gone to jail, or you will go to jail, and sometime soon, because they're just doing massive night raids and arresting a lot of people at once, and so they try to mask their identity. Oftentimes, Israeli units on the other side will have a cameraman just photographing everyone involved. In Bielin, they actually constructed a very high-tech tower to film the entire demonstration, which ironically hasn't helped their case that much, because it shows when they say Abdallah Abu Rahman has been throwing stones, there's actually video evidence that he's not throwing stones, but that doesn't seem to matter, because the military court system is basically a kangaroo court system, kind of like Guantanamo, but not exactly the same. It's a court system that has a 99.7 incarceration rate, and if I'm not mistaken, something like a 13.5-minute average trial. So it's very much a conveyor belt, and this is something that's really not discussed, how occupation law is being used and implemented to crush the nonviolent demonstrations. But as I said, European diplomats, the Americans tend to decline the invitation to attend these trials. European diplomats are getting on board with what's going on and monitoring these things, and the UK Foreign Secretary and possibly other foreign dignitaries are going to be attending summits with Palestinian nonviolent leaders, and showing solidarity for this model of coexistence and nonviolence. And here we are. This is Abdallah Abu Rahman in the back being arrested in Bielin, and an Israeli activist in the front, capturing this element of joint struggle and joint kind of coexistence, solidarity, etc. I very much encourage everyone here in internet world to look into the information about Abdallah Abu Rahman's trial. Not only because it's so fresh, but because it really captures the way that Israel is trying to repress these demonstrations. Because there's a very, very significant interest on the Israeli side to crush these things. Israel does not know how to operate against a unified, unarmed, nonviolent Palestinian entity. Everything that it does is to push the Palestinians towards violence, because when there's violence emanating from the Palestinian side, one can forget about the occupation, one can forget about the building of the separation wall inside Palestinian territory, because it's easy to paint Palestinians as terrorists or whatever. And so when the Palestinians actually start a model of nonviolence and coexistence, it's quite difficult to paint them all as bad guys. I'm being told that we need to finish up, but I'm sure there'll be some questions. I just want to end with this photo in terms of the joint solidarity. I think it really captures something that's going on that's very much alive on the ground right now. Here you have an Israeli activist on the bottom, a Palestinian activist on the top, and the Israelis literally hugging the Palestinian to keep him from going to jail and being arrested by the troops, using the privilege. But literally, this is coexistence, well, in one of its most pure forms, in my opinion. And so the ability for us to find solutions and the space in which we can carve out real grassroots initiative of discussion and friendship and things like that is very much alive as a result of this manifestation of nonviolence in the West Bank, Palestinian unarmed resistance. And this is something that needs to be discussed more in the international community, and that the international community has a very important role in helping. Just in terms of discussion, but also in terms of lobbying, your governments and things like that to say that we support this model of resistance. So let's open it up to questions at this point.